Hey guys, Cam here from 9 to 5 Google, and this is the Oppo F1 Plus, and it's actually rather good. It looks like an iPhone. There's no way getting around it, but now we've got that out the way, let's continue. There's a lot to like about the F1 Plus's design. The all-metal back has an attractive, soft anodized finish, which is neither too glossy or too dull. It also happens to have really good looking rounded edges and corners, which aren't just aesthetically pleasing but also combine with the thinness of the phone to make it easy to hold in one hand. It's still a stretch to reach some areas on screen, but it never gets tiring to hold and use. Now what's a little unusual is that the metal body's shiny chamfered edges don't quite reach all the way up the edges, making the brilliant white front panel look like it's sticking out a little. It's not necessarily a terrible thing, it's just unusual. The rest of the front panel is pretty impressive. The bezel on the sides of the screen is really thin, and the fingerprint sensor home button has an attractive gold ring around it. It's flanked on either side by two capacitive buttons which only really light up when pressed. They're hard to see to begin with, and that makes them hard to use at the start, especially if you come from a phone where the back and app switching buttons are arranged the other way around. Still, they save space on the bottom of the screen, and I don't mind that. While the phone is pretty, light and sturdy enough, I did face a couple of issues with the phone's design. Both the front glass and the metal finish on the back seem really easy to scratch. Despite not being treated with any overdue force, they both have noticeable marks on them with only a week's worth of use. So if you buy one, don't do what I did. Leave the pre-applied screen protector on and use the included case. Now it's hard to know where to start with the ColorOS software. It's equally hard to list what I noticed without it sounding like a one-sided rant about yet another Chinese smartphone maker with a terrible user interface. So let's start with this. It's not terrible, but it needs improvement in a lot of areas. Ignoring the fact that the default launcher has no app drawer, there's just too much about the user interface and stock apps that's clearly taking inspiration from the iPhone. The card-based app switcher view, the calendar, the calculator, the camera, and phone call apps all look like iOS. In fact, they're so similar it's almost hilarious. Even the way you uninstall apps by pressing and holding an icon and pressing the X, and then watching them automatically arrange themselves on the screen is eerily close to Apple's bespoke software. Now my other complaints are for daily tools that I use, things like Do Not Disturb, which can't be activated simply by pressing and holding the volume down key, or via an easy quick toggle on the drop-down menu. You have to dig into the settings. There's also the fact that it really doesn't like having a third-party launcher set as its default. I found it often just switched back to the system default despite manually changing it, particularly when I tried to use Nova Launcher. But despite all of my complaints, I really like the general cleanness of the user interface. It's sharp and minimal and mostly uncluttered. The settings menu is nice to look at, and the pre-installed TouchPal keyboard is among the easiest to type on that I've ever used. Also, like a lot of Android skins, it has its own set of useful gestures for launching specific apps and functions. So you can select to have it wake up when you double tap the screen, or you can launch the camera when you draw an O shape, or launch the torch on the back when you draw a V. Now we're getting to the point with displays on smartphones now where it's very rare to find a device sporting a bad screen. Almost everything in the mid-tier market upwards has a 1080p resolution panel with great colour accuracy, sharpness and brightness. That's certainly the case for the Oppo F1 Plus. The 5.5-inch 1080p AMOLED display is great. Colours are vibrant, which is really helped by all the brightly coloured icons from the stock applications. Viewing angles are good and colours don't distort too much when looking at it from an angle. There's really not anything else really to say about it, it's just a good screen. Moving on to the cameras, and I'm going to talk more about the front-facing camera than the rear one. The main 13-megapixel camera on the back is fine. Its f-stop 2.2 aperture and phase detection autofocus means you get mostly clear, sharp images with adequate depth of field. There's no OIS, and there is noise when you're using low light images, but it's a passable smartphone camera and even has manual controls. Now the front camera packs in even more pixels than the rear one. It's 16 megapixels, and despite its relative tardiness and tendency to create blurry images if you move too quickly, it can take some really sharp images with good colour. And you don't normally get that from a selfie camera. Now with 4GB of RAM, a 2GHz Octa-Core MediaTek P10 processor, you'd assume that the F1 Plus has no trouble with performance. And you'd be right. Switching between apps and various parts of the overall interface is almost always smooth. Apps and games load quickly, as does web content. Now, it's not the fastest, snappiest phone I've ever used, and the frame rate isn't exactly speedy during intense gaming, but it's not sluggish. Frame drops and stuttering does happen, but not so much that you'd complain about it being a slow, laggy phone. Battery likewise is decent. The 2850 mAh battery can easily make its way through a full day, even with heavy usage. It's not quite a 2-day battery, but it's good enough. And it does have a trick up its sleeve. Using Oppo's proprietary VOOC charging, you can charge it from 0 to 100% in just over an hour. So even if your battery does drain, you can charge it up incredibly quickly. In fact, it charges almost as quickly when being used and doesn't get overly warm, as I discovered in a recent test, and I'll leave the link to that video below. Now, as an overall package, despite its flaws and imperfections, I can't pretend like I didn't enjoy using the Oppo F1 Plus. The company got a lot right with it, and many of those things are appreciable on a daily basis in regular day-to-day usage. It feels great in hand despite being big, it runs smoothly most of the time and has a keyboard that's easy to type on. It even has a fairly good camera. Yes, there are many improvements to be made, both from a hardware and software perspective, but I'd happily use this as my daily driver. I've been Cam at Cam Bunsen on Twitter, and I'll see you again soon.